Let's talk about generations now at work. And generations in your life, actually, and in your church. We've talked about the gender, and we've talked about the culture and the ethnicity piece. What you have now is, within the church structure, you have basically four different generations that are there worshiping together. What you need to realize, even if they're, very, very similar in their ethnic backgrounds and in their racial background and their gender background and whatnot, each of the generations is going to be seeing the world from a slightly different perspective. So it becomes very, very important to understand that, okay? Let's take the veteran generation. Tom Brokaw calls it the Great Generation, the ones who fought World War II. They were also the ones that were raised during the Great Depression. And now they're the ones who are going to be your silver-haired members of your congregation, okay? Sometimes the deep pockets in your congregation too, and they also do a lot of the voting in our world. So even though they're not necessarily as active as they once were, they have often a lot of power to them. One church I was working with, by the way, let me tell you this before I get into this. They actually had two congregations in some ways. And they had two, it was all connected by their, it wasn't even a narthex, it was more of an inner courtyard with a little bit of a cafe there and tables and chairs. But on one side was a very, very formal kind of a sanctuary. Fixed pews, altar up front. It's very liturgical in a lot of ways, very formal and all of that. On the other side was the basically under 30 group. In fact, a lot of times they just sat on the floor. And again, we're talking, it's only 100 feet away from the other congregation. But they're over here, have a stage up there with guitars and drums going and all kinds of that kind of stuff. The kids would bring coffee into the service along with donuts and whatever else they got in the cafe. Incredibly, they're dressed in jeans and t-shirts, as is the minister, because it was one of the young ministers on this staff that was doing it. Now here was the problem. The problem was that young church was growing exponentially, and the other church, the older church, had leveled off, okay? Now it made the most sense that they actually flipped where they met. The older church was declining in numbers, and the other one was rising in numbers. But you have these two different settings. One with the fixed pews, and the other one with, this completely informal setting. It would take, in other words, a lot of remodeling, number one, to switch them, but it would have all kinds of implications, especially to the older congregation. And of course, the last factor that was important in this is that the much smaller, older congregation gave 85% of the budget. So whoever pays the fiddler calls the tune, and this was becoming much more of an issue here. So let's talk about the veterans. Veterans, just several things to say about them. I'm going to say several about them and the boomers and the Xers and the millennialists. The veterans, though, really like consistency and uniformity. They've liked things on a grand scale in a lot of ways. They tend much more to be conformers in many ways. They believe in logic, not magic. They're very much from the modern era, as opposed to the young people who are much more in the postmodern world. And those are very, very important distinctions to make. So the veterans tend to be much more the realist, if you will. They believe in authority. They believe in the march of science and progression as a result of that, tend to be very disciplined. And often, especially as they get older, they're very past-oriented and very history-absorbed. especially, and I've talked to a number of veterans from the Second World War, and they will talk on and on about their experiences. I was just with my wife's uncle who fought in the Second World War, and very much looking backward in a lot of ways to what has been there. They believe very much in law and order is very important to them. And their spending style tends to be very conservative. Remember, they were raised in the Depression when there was an extreme limit to resources, and the need to conserve and retain was very, very important to them. So if some of these people are on your board or in your vestry, you can begin then to see what their orientation is going to be. And you're going to have to allow for that, because there's a good chance that they may be some of your deep pockets in the congregation too. So if you want to shoot off into various directions that do not coincide with what they believe to be appropriate, you could be in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. Let's talk about boomers. You're looking at one here in this tape. I'm a boomer. In fact, I was born the first year of the boomers, so I'm one of the early ones there. Boomers believe in growth and expansion, very, very important to us. We tend to think of ourselves as the stars of the show in many ways. We were raised that way, tend to be very optimistic, which is very true of me. We learn teamwork very much at school and at home when we were growing up. We tended to, and this is probably the biggest characteristic of us, is we tended to pursue our own personal gratification, often at the price of other people, as a matter of fact. I mean, you look at the drug culture and a lot of the things that came about back then was very much a part of all of this, and very much, though, on what you can even consider a spiritual journey in some ways. Very much inwardly facing, as opposed to the veterans, by the way, which tended to be much more outwardly faced. We faced inward. Now you're going to come back, and now we're going to come around to the Xers, which again tend to be much more outwardly faced in a lot of ways. But Xers tend to be much more self-reliant, seek a sense of family and want balance in many ways, tend to be non-traditional oriented about time and space, and often like a sense of informality. Now again, as you begin to see these generations, as they begin to sit down at table with one another and try to come to decision about what should be the direction of our church now, you can see where it can become very, very difficult. Xers tend to be technically savvy, although they're not as technically savvy as the next group here that we're going to talk about, which you can call them millennialists or nexters. They're called different things, obviously. Millennialists tend to be, first of all, incredibly technologically savvy. I will always, at my age, will always be a technology immigrant, which means I'll always speak technology with an accent. The young generation do not speak with an accent. They know, my 5-year-old grandson knows more about the Apple world and the iPad than I'll ever know. He's grown up with it. He does not speak with an accent. It doesn't scare him. It's now completely intuitive to him, whereas technology is always, I always feel like I'm in kind of a herky-jerky kind of a way of dealing with it. Xers tend to like informality. They really very much want to participate in what it is that they're doing. The whole Wikipedia world is an example of that. I don't want to read the encyclopedia. I want to help write the encyclopedia. So you have young people who very much want to participate in that. Now, as you're reaching for a capital campaign and you have all of these different generations trying to decide where we should allocate resources, you can begin to see where you can run into some serious problems. The older generations like to build buildings, and they become symbols to us of many different things, and those buildings need to look formal and whatnot. The younger generations, not particularly speaking to them at all. That is not particularly important to them. I do think it's very, very important to have all these people present and talking in the decision-making discussions, but you have to be and maintain that blue zone among them, or it can get red zone very quickly, where the older people are yelling at the young people and, you know, saying you're a bunch of irresponsible, or you always wanted a trophy even though you just showed up and you didn't really achieve anything, and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. It can get red zone very, very quickly. So understanding, and I've given you some other slides here you can look at, and there's a lot written on generations. I think it's very important to understand how generations actually see the world and how they will then go about languaging it and making decisions accordingly.